Hello, folks, and welcome. I'm Christy Nicholas, and I will be reading the first scene from my novel, Age of Druids, today. Age of Druids is the 9th and final book in my Druids Brooch series. It's set in 5th century Ireland, just as Christianity is taking hold across the island via a rather famous man, later known as St. Patrick. Please remember to click like and subscribe, and let me know what you think of the scene in the comments. I will be recording the first scenes of other books in the series in the coming weeks. Now, without further ado, Age of Druids. Late winter, 442 CE, Lochri, Eri. Her baby's screech stabbed through Clíodhna's skull, making her want to abandon Aileron and escape into blessed silence. She wished to be somewhere in the forest, on a hill, surrounded by buzzing bees and yelling flowers, perhaps flying over the rolling hills with a flock of starlings. Her brief idyll crashed when another scream broke through. She sighed and picked him up, rocking him against her shoulder while stirring the iron pot. Clíodhna cast an eye for her middle child, Dawn, who helped a lot but tended to wander off and get into trouble. She found no sign of him, but someone yelled at the horses outside. He must be doing farm chores. Aileron cuddled into her shoulder and let out a wet burp, and promptly fell asleep, a warm weight against her neck. His hand curled around a hank of her black hair, pulling just enough to make her wince. At the same time, his adorable smile invoked her own. Despite her frustration, she loved her baby boy. It had been a dozen winters since her womb had quickened, but she'd been glad of the new child after so long, especially after losing one daughter at birth. Clíodhna glanced out the window of the large roundhouse. She glimpsed Dawn unharnessing the plow with practiced hands. Though he counted but 14 winters, he needed to be the man of the house, since his father disappeared. The baby fussed again, whimpering in his sleep. She rocked him, still stirring the stew in the pot. They'd only a few meals of dried lamb left from the autumn harvest, but still had plenty of onions and turnips, as well as chives and garlic. At least Oseen had left them a workable farm before he disappeared. She used to sell small wooden carvings she'd made, but who found time for such frivolity now? The odor of char caught her attention, and she cursed as she tried to swivel the pot off the fire. She needed to add more water before it scorched. Baby still in hand, she bent to the bucket, trying to lift it without waking the child. She failed. His screams shot right through her ears, a physical pain that made her drop the bucket. The water splashed on the flagstone floor. Son of a diseased donkey! Clíodhna! Such language! She whirled to see Ita, a blonde woman from the village, standing in the doorway, her hand upon her heart. Sorry, Ita. Can you help me for a moment? I need about 5 extra hands. I can see that. Here, let me take the wee one. She reached out to take Aileron, who yanked on Clíodhna's hair so hard it brought tears to her eyes. She tried to be patient with her son. Let go, Aileron. There's a good babe. A crash outside made her whimper. Ita smiled. Go, check on your lad out there. I've got Aileron well in hand, don't I, wee thing? We're going to get on just grand. She touched the baby's nose, eliciting a giggle from the ungrateful wretch. Clíodhna gave them one last lingering glance before she rushed out to find out what trouble Dawn fell into. The boy lay half under a bale of hay, struggling to pull his leg out, his face screwed up in frustration. Trying to suppress a chuckle, Clíodhna lifted the edge so he could extract himself. How did you get under there, Dawn? He pouted, wiping the straw from his lenya. When I brought Tin into his stall, he reared. I staggered back and hit the pile. The top one fell on me. It didn't hurt, though. Clíodhna eyed the stack of hay, assessing the sturdiness of the remaining bales, while trying to stifle a chuckle. They look stout enough to me. You must have hit the bale hard. He didn't answer, but looked at his foot, shuffling it in the dirt. Yeah, I hit it hard. Tin reared pretty high. Clíodhna gave him a kind smile. I suppose a full-grown horse rearing up high can be rather scary, even to a sturdy lad of 14 winters. I'm glad you are smart enough to back up. A frightened horse can be dangerous. I know, Ma. Am I in trouble? Of course not. But you still have chores left. Can you fetch me 2 more buckets of water? He squinted at her. Don't you still have one? I just brought one in before I plowed. Unfortunately, I dropped that one trying to put more water in the stew. Oh, my stew! She rushed back into the roundhouse, but saw that Ita had moved the stew well away from the hearth. Thank you, Ita. I'm sorry to leave you with him so long. The older woman grinned, handing the baby back. He's been a lovely lad. I miss my own babies. They're all grown and starting families of their own now. Hopefully I'll have grandchildren soon to play with. Oh, that reminds me. I saw Etroma in the village. She said to tell you she might be later than she expected. Clíodhna frowned. Her eldest daughter spent far too much time with the blacksmith's boy, Tirashan, for her peace of mind. Etroma counted 16 winters, a marriageable age, and made her choice clear. However, the blacksmith would never pair his son, full of high status, to Etroma. As the daughter of a single woman with a small farm, they held very little status. A blacksmith stood second only to a bard or Druid, as he possessed the magic of creating iron. His sons could have their pick of any woman they wanted, but the father would choose the most advantageous mate. In the meantime, Etroma would only make a fool of herself hanging around, trying to impress the lad, and possibly get herself with child in the process, none of which would increase their status in the slightest. She'd almost forgotten Ita still stood in her house. Her guest stirred the pot idly while Clíodhna lost herself in musings. After clearing her throat, Clíodhna asked, Did you come over to ask something, Ita, before I so rudely recruited you into an assistant? With a chuckle, Ita glanced up from the stew. I did, actually. I wondered if you were going to join me for the next meeting with the monks tomorrow morning. The monks? You mean those strange men set up in the glade? Why would I do that? She laughed. Well, for one, you can bring your children. It might give them something interesting to do other than get in trouble. They also teach classes, skills like beekeeping or baking. Clíodhna wrinkled her nose. I already know how to bake. You do, yes, but does Dawn? And being part of the community means you might have more help with the children when you need an extra hand. She glanced at the baby, now sleeping in her arms, and Don, who came in with 2 buckets sloshing full of water. He grinned at Ita and carried them to the hearth. With a glance at Clíodhna, he poured some into the kettle and swung the iron arm back over the fire. Ita glanced at him. Good lad, you'll make some woman a grand husband some day. While Clíodhna completely agreed, she resented the other woman saying it before she could. Don was her child. Her friend had raised her brood already. Clíodhna chided herself. The woman merely wanted to help, and the gods knew Clíodhna needed help. She hadn't enjoyed a good night's rest in moons. 5, to be exact, ever since Osine left. For several months, Clíodhna tried to convince herself his absence wasn't her fault. They'd had no argument. She knew of no other woman. No long-lost relative came seeking help. He'd simply gone out hunting one day. When he didn't come back by the first night, she'd thought little of it. He often stayed out overnight, especially if he found no deer. By the second night, however, she'd grown concerned. By the fourth night, she'd gathered several men from the village and asked them for help. Together they'd combed the nearby woods, searching for sign of either the hunter or his belongings. They found nothing. The best trackers in the village found not one clue. Not even a trace of a footstep in the mud. Clíodhna even lost her last horse to the search, when he got mired in a bog and broke his leg trying to escape. She'd loved riding that horse to escape her life when she could. That time was over now, with 3 children to care for. Speculation to his fate ran rampant through the small community. The most common theory was that he'd been taken by the fairies. Others posited he'd just left to start a new life. He'd fallen into a bog and suffocated, or he'd hidden himself and laughed at them all for their searching. He'd been fond of playing jokes on people, and the latter seemed plausible. However, as the season marched on and no sign of him appeared, a joke appeared less likely. Clíodhna muddled on as best she could, vacillating between resentment, freedom, and loneliness. At least he'd left her with a full pantry from the summer crop and dried lamb, beef, and fish from his hunting and fishing forays. He'd been a great hunter. His skill with the bow remained unrivaled, and he traded his furs and meat in the market on good days. Before he left, he'd taught Atroma to use the bow, and she possessed a great deal of skill. She'd brought down 2 deer this winter, which helped tremendously. Don would never be a great hunter, but he adored fishing. Between the 2 of them and her own weaving efforts, they survived the winter. However, she'd found it difficult to tend the house and raise the children at the same time. Perhaps being part of this monk community might help. She glanced at Ita, still stirring the kettle, waiting for her answer. What could it hurt to see what these monks had to say? "Very well, Ita. I'll come with you tomorrow." "When?" "Just after dawn." "Dawn? That's when we milk the cows." "The cows can be milked earlier, can't they?" "Just give it a try. There is a love feast afterward." Letting out a deep breath, Clíodhna glanced at her baby and agreed. Well, thank you so much for enjoying this excerpt. Please remember to like and subscribe to my channel. You can get your copy of Age of Druids at my publisher, www.tirpub.com/C.Nicholas. I also have links on my website at greendragonartist.com. Thank you.